Yes.
Okay, everybody. This is Dalia, the coordinator of the HLP area of responsibility. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope technology works. We're giving it a go today. Can I ask everyone please to switch off their, or mute, sorry, their microphones if they're not speaking or asking a question, because otherwise we can all hear the background noise, so that would be helpful. So today we're going to have a look, well, we've got 3 colleagues who are going to present about some of their experiences in terms of housing, land and property issues, and how they've related to CCCM interventions. So looking at what kind of housing, land and property issues have come up in camp settings, how camp management actors have dealt with those, some of the experiences, the challenge, really to take the next step into discussing what kind of issues, because I think they're coming up a lot in terms of, in a lot of the contexts where we're working. So thinking about what are those issues, what are some of the possible responses and some of the preventative techniques as well, and what's the role of CCCM actors as part of the humanitarian community looking at housing, land and property issues. So we have 3 colleagues today who are going to present. First, Kirsty Farmer from Norwegian Refugee Council, who's going to give us just a bit of an overview of the work that the NRC has done and some of the interesting issues that have come up in relation to their camp management work when it comes to housing, land and property. Then we'll hear from Catherine Zigger to look at the context in Somalia. Catherine's the CCCM cluster coordinator there. And then Yasmin, who will present about experiences in Myanmar and a bit of Iraq, I think, as well, in terms of some of the issues found there. Yasmin is from the Norwegian Refugee Council as well, camp management specialist in Iraq at the moment. So anyway, I wanted to hand over first of all to Kirsty to sort of set the scene for us a little bit and present on some of the work that NRC has been doing in relation to housing and camp management. Just to let you know that we'll have the 3 presentations and then open it up for any questions and discussion after those. So handing over to Kirsty now. Thank you.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And nice to see so many people that have joined this call. It's fantastic. And we hope we have some good questions and answers and reflections at the end. As Dalia said, I'm just going to give a very brief overview of some of the reflections that NRC has been doing, working with our camp management colleagues in our different country offices. And then I'm going to hand over to other colleagues to give you a more in-depth understanding of some of the HLP challenges that they are facing in the field and how they're addressing them. So we realize through our work, hi Waleed, it seems like you've got some background noise. If you could switch your mic.
Yeah,
great.
thank you. Yeah.
So in NRC, obviously we've been working a lot over the years on in combination with our legal assistance programs and looking at HLP issues in shelter, and together with shelter colleagues looking at some of the challenges they're facing in their programs and how they are addressing them. And one of the other issues, of course, that's coming up a lot is that camp management colleagues are working in the same environments, and they're also working in informal settlements, in camps, out of camps, where all of these issues are coming up as well. And what we wanted to really understand was how HLP issues are coming up in camps. What kind of issues are we understanding? What are the risks for NRC as we engage in camps and informal settlements? But most importantly, how are the people we work with, how are the displaced experiencing their different HLP issues and challenges? So also to understand, to break down a little bit the overarching point of HLP. And from this sense, I think it's useful if we can focus more on security of tenure, the ability to stay in your place, even in displacement, and understand how long you can be there, understand if you can invest in your property, understand if you invest, can you take it with you? Some of the, who owns the land, who are you, perhaps paying money to? So all of these issues we decided to look into much more in an internal study. And one of the outcomes of that study you will see is a particular focus from our Syria program, and that has come up with, it was actually worked on interagency in the end, with some guidance on working in informal settlements and camps in northern Syria. So I think that's a good starting point for one of the outcomes of our project. I mean, one of the things that overarching when we work with colleagues is to just, first of all, explain that the security of tenure issues that are coming up in camps and settlements are being dealt with by camp management colleagues on a daily basis. And I think sometimes this is something that we need to emphasize. They are addressing these issues and problem solving with communities on a daily basis. And so some of the things that we're seeing that they're tackling, obviously, in many contexts that you are working in, you're working on threats of eviction, people being evicted, relocation and forced eviction through relocation projects. You're looking at issues around rental distress and people having to leave or being forced to leave because they can't pay their rent. You're looking at issues of overcrowding and how to solve those. And of course, the big issues that are coming up are camps that have been self-settled and are on disputed land, or land where landowners are charging NGOs a lot of money for them, or they're just overall disputed in that sense. So I think the complexity of issues that are coming up, not just in informal settlements, but across the board, are too complex to go into today. But I just wanted to acknowledge that this is something that camp management colleagues are dealing with on a daily basis as they work in these contexts and try to problem solve. And the other thing that we do in NRC is that addressing HLP issues. Hi, DRC. If you could mute your microphone in Iraq, that would be great, thanks. So I think we often think in the past, not anymore, but in the past we've often thought of HLP issues as only being solved through a legal intervention. And one of the reflections, of course, could you mute your microphone in DRC, Iraq?
Yep.
Thanks. So one of the reflections is that to address security of tenure issues, it's not just the legal component, although that is important. It's a whole range of components of working with communities, working with host communities of different skill sets, trying to prevent disputes that might lead to eviction. So camp management colleagues in NRC, we looked at the different methodologies and ways that they are addressing HLP disputes and threats of eviction, for example. And obviously one of the strongest methodologies that camp management bring to this is their community engagement and participation with the communities to look at and really understand the issues and to be able to problem solve in a way that is perhaps representative of the ways that they would want to see problems, much better than some of our other approaches. Also, in terms of referral, I think sometimes understanding the whole range of different responses that is required because of the complexity of security of tenure issues. Dealing with rental distress is not necessarily about just strengthening a tenancy agreement. It's also looking at livelihoods approaches and referral around that. So the camp management colleagues are bringing in a more holistic referral, perhaps mechanism or ways to address these. And of course, the conflict resolution and the advocacy that is such an important part of trying to solve some of these really complicated issues. So with that said, I think we also reflected on how our colleagues could work better across the sectors. I think this is something that we are really also trying to work with in the HLP AoR. How do camp management and the skills that they bring to solving HLP or security of tenure issues in camps and informal settlements, how does that work together in combination with our shelter and our legal assistance programs, and how can we make the best use of that? And I think that's something that's still a work in progress. And as well, one of the things we discussed is learning from colleagues about how they are addressing and solving some of these issues, and what the gaps perhaps in capacity are, in the sense of maybe understanding the new sphere security of tenure standard, and how that can be a useful overarching guidance for driving some of the conversations that need to be had in country, as well as, of course, the shelter cluster due diligence standard. Due diligence is coming up, obviously, as a critical issue, not only before camps are built or established, but also due diligence to understand different land claims in camps that have been self-settled and that we're working in, and what some of the red lines might be around those, and how those are managed. So I think one of our colleagues, Jasmine, might be talking about that in a bit. She gives a very good example of how to address that, or at least struggling with some of the problems. And so one of the things that has come up in terms of the capacity building is recognizing the huge negotiation, dispute resolution, and mediation work that's been done by all of our colleagues in trying to work out these issues and prevent disputes from happening and leading to evictions in the first place, and putting people really at the center of determining how they are living and their security of tenure. And I think that's one of the areas of focus that we've discussed would be really useful, is those soft skills and building them even further within our teams. So if I had to summarize NRC's approach to this internally, I would say that we are really learning a lot at the moment. We're recognizing the really important role of camp management in bringing a skill set and a methodology to a problem that requires a really across-the-board holistic approach to solve them, not operating in silos, and figuring out where the challenges are, learning from colleagues who are working through these issues about the actual main points of support and intervention can be to solving some of these discussions. And if it's about tools, maybe not, but really about how these are adapted and how these are able to actually guide people through those critical decision-making processes. And really also to have a step back as well. I mean, I think one of it is the due diligence guidelines from the shelter cluster that really asks us to consider sometimes doing nothing is the best option. So really to have that stand back approach and understanding when it is that, for example, we should be looking at doing no harm, and the risk analysis for the people that we're working with, and how we can take that into account overall in our operations from a more broader perspective. So that was a bit of a sort of whistle-stop tour through our thinking. I think hopefully it will have more meaning and context when our colleagues are explaining the way that they are considering this as well. And I'm happy to listen to suggestions and considerations and questions at the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Kirsty. That was really useful overview and setting the scene for some of the contexts, specific things that are going to come up now with Catherine and Yasmin. So I'll leave questions and comments on to after all of the presentations, so that we get a chance to hear from everyone and get then have a chance for questions and any discussion. So I'm going to hand over to Catherine now, who's going to be sharing experiences of Somalia with us. So over to you, Catherine.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm going to leave my camera off because I think the internet's not strong enough. But basically, my name is Catherine. I'm the CCCM cluster coordinator in Somalia. I'm going to start with just a basic overview of what's happening in Somalia. So in the end of 2016 and early 2017, there was a drought. There was, before the drought, an estimated about 1 million people already displaced in Somalia, but the drought and conflict caused another 1.6 million people to become displaced. The CCCM cluster was activated around 6 months after the drought started in May of 2017. And when we began working, there was no data on how many IDP sites were in the country, how many people were displaced, etc. So now that we've been in existence for a bit over a year, there's about 2,000 IDP sites in Somalia. Most of them are on private land. Only 8% are actually on public land. Displaced people are usually coming from rural areas to more urban areas to access services and better security, because in Somalia, most of the urban areas are held by the government. And then around 20 kilometers out, they're more Al-Shabaab controlled areas. So when we started working, we started CCCM activities. One of the biggest challenges we came up with was the threat of eviction. So everyone who's coming into these towns is basically renting like space on private land. So on a daily basis, the CCCM partners were running into a lot of evictions, lack of land tenure, et cetera, and they had basically no idea what to do. So we started working with the HLP subcluster a bit and formulating an idea of how we were going to deal with this. So about a year ago, maybe a year after the cluster was activated, 6 months ago, we had a workshop with the HLP partners, namely NRC, and some protection partners to kind of discuss a way forward on how CCCM and HLP partners could work together and actually look at this risk of eviction and see like how we're gonna work on this together. Basically what we found was it's impossible to do CCCM when you're working in private sites without understanding the land tenure. And so on a daily basis, we are getting several families evicted, up to hundreds of families evicted, and we didn't know who to go to, they didn't know where to go. So it was just like an ad hoc response where the partners would be running around different districts, looking for new land, talking to the government, et cetera. So what we decided, we had this workshop with all the key partners, led by NRC and the HLP subcluster, and they did a brief training on what HLP was and the roles of it. One of the biggest things we see in Somalia is that often when there's an eviction, partners or the government or anyone just yells, HLP, please deal with it. And I think people didn't have a very good understanding of what actually the HLP subcluster did or the HLP partners did. There was a big eviction in Mogadishu, I think around Christmas of 2016 or 2017, I can't remember. And about 20,000 people were evicted and everyone just looked around at each other and said, what is HLP gonna do about it? And so there's a big lack of understanding about what actually is the role of these HLP partners. So we had this workshop with them. They explained to all of our focal points in different districts and our partners on what HLP is, what they can do, and we looked at formulating a way forward. So one of the things that we've done is to just develop we did a eviction risk tool with the HLP partner. So basically it's a tool that goes through all the sites. So in most areas, there's not just like 4 or 5 sites in a district, there's hundreds. So in one town called Baido, where there's 250,000 people displaced, there's 380 sites. And so they're small sites, usually made up of several hundred households or up to 1,000 households. And they're on these private farms. So our partners went around, we worked with the subcluster and they helped us to design this tool that we were able to implement in the areas that we were working. And it kind of gave us an understanding of the eviction risk status of each site. So the tool kind of goes over tenure type, if it's private land, if they're paying rent, if they're not paying rent, if they're squatting. Agreement type, if it's written, oral, or there's no agreement, the length of the agreement and the dates. And then there's a risk level that corresponds with all the information, low, medium, high, extreme. Some examples of what would be high risk is that there'd be no written agreement, or they're nearing the end of the agreement and the owner or the landlord doesn't want to extend it. Or extreme is that the eviction threat has been issued and the eviction date is already planned. So basically what we've done, because the HLP partners are a smaller group, we have, in each area, maybe 50 community mobilizers, 25, etc. So we're able to collect the data for the HLP subcluster. We give it to them, they analyze it, they give it back to us, and then we follow up on a regular basis with the landlords on this. So if there's an eviction threat that's been issued or an eviction date planned, we'll call a meeting with all the relevant partners, who would be the local authorities, protection partners, HLP partners, the IDP leaders of the site, and then they'll have a meeting and try to decide what is the best solution for this. So it could be extension of the lease or extension of the agreement. It could be relocation to another area. It could be breaking, some people go to some sites, etc. So the response is still quite ad hoc, but then the response is taken up from whoever the relevant partner is. So if it's more on a legal standpoint, then NRC will deal with it. They'll negotiate a longer lease. If it's not from a legal standpoint, sometimes CCCM will step in. If it's a relocation, we'll support them to relocate. If it's more like an individual response for a vulnerable family, then the protection partner can step in. But in each district, it's a bit different on the response. but it's been like relatively successful, at least on raising the attention of eviction in these areas, and then showing that it's the responsibility of everyone. It's not just the responsibility of the HLP partner, and that we're all in this, especially the government, and that we have to come forward with some solutions. So one of the more successful stories that we had was in this place I mentioned before called Baidoa, where there was, after the mass eviction in Mogadishu, the government of Baidoa, who was dealing with, as I said, 250,000 displaced people, the host community is around the same amount, so it's 50-50 displaced and host. They were saying they need to get ahead of evictions before it becomes a massive problem for the town, and that they wanted to be able to ensure that people who were displaced to Baidoa had a safe place to stay. So after a bit of discussion with the local authorities, HLP, Protection Partners, and CCCM, they decided to allocate some land for displaced people to temporarily reside on. So it's not a durable solution by any means, but it allows for them to stay there with secure land tenure because it's public space by the government. They can stay there as long as they want until they understand what their next options are and next steps are in life. And this came about just from the more focus that was put in this particular district on the risk of evictions that people were facing. In other areas, it's a bit different. Mogadishu is a bit more difficult. So we keep up the tracking just to use for advocacy points, and then to be able to support the families who are being evicted. But there's maybe 500,000 displaced people in Mogadishu and anywhere from 500 to 1,000 sites. So it's a bit of a different ballgame. But basically in the last year, the lessons we've learned with working together with the HLP subcluster is that every area does need a more tailored approach to how we're gonna be able to support displaced people. And that it is the role of all actors involved in the humanitarian and development response and the government to be looking at HLP issues and what they can do. And we're just trying to sensitize displaced people on the importance of this and where they can seek support, and then where are areas that are kind of out of the hands of humanitarian partners. So I think that's it from my side.
Thanks, Catherine. That was really interesting. Thank you for the background, the context, as well as the experiences there. I'm sure there'll be some things there for questions and discussion. Thank you. So the last presentation we're going to have is from Yasmin, who's with NRC Iraq. Now, I have a presentation which I'm going to try and share my screen, which Yasmin has shared with me, so that you should be able to see it as well. Just putting that into place, and then Yasmin, if you let me know once it's up, what when to move the presentation along. I'll just, I thought I was there. Yeah, okay. Hopefully you'll be able to see that. I'll just make it a little bit bigger. Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm giving you all the secrets. Okay, no, let's start maybe before I try to do anything else. All right, so I'll hand over to you, Yasmin. If you'll also just introduce yourself as well, that would be handy. Thank you. Over to you, Yasmin. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Yasmin. I'm currently the camp management specialist for NRC in Iraq. But prior to coming here, I was in Myanmar for a year, and that's what I'll predominantly be talking about in today's discussion. And so I'll be linking back to a lot of the things that Christy and Catherine have already touched upon, but looking at when we deal with HLP issues in CCCM, how do we deal with that when we're being reactive, and what can we do to be more proactive about tackling those issues before we're engaging in whether they're formal or informal sites of displacement. So Dalia, if you could go to the next slide. Right, so HLP issues in camps. For brief context of the situation in Myanmar, as you may be aware, there has been ongoing strife between the government and the military and the Rohingya population, predominantly in northern Rakhine. And so at the moment, there are still about 120,000 Rohingya who are in camps in Rakhine State. Those camps were kind of established in a dramatic rush after violence broke out against the Rohingya population. And so they were not planned in advance, and they were placed on land that the government either already owned or had taken from local farmers. Now, of course, this presented us with a wide variety of issues when having to work in those camps. And so we were facing issues such as the wash partner would like to add additional latrines in one sector, and suddenly a landowner appears and says, no, that is my land. You cannot put a latrine there. And if you are going to put a latrine there, I'm going to charge you 100 USD per latrine. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, most NGOs do not budget in for that type of money when placing services in a humanitarian setting. So this was coming up more and more frequently, especially as time went on and the community who lived around the borders of the camps was getting tired of the humanitarian service provision, also because Rakhine State is one of the poorest in the country. And so they felt disenfranchised from the government, and then were, the humanitarian actors were perceived to only be supporting the Rohingya. And so as this dragged on over several years, more and more HLP issues were coming up. So this put us in a bit of a pickle as to how we were going to proceed, knowing that we had to provide humanitarian services to this population, but also knowing that we were now facing issues with the landowners. And so as you can see on the slide, there were a couple of things that came up there. One being compensation. If this was in fact the rightful landowner of said land, had the government provided them with compensation when annexing their land into the camp, yes or no? And who was really responsible for that? Which branch of government? Even that was highly unclear at times. And then it came down to documentation. The government was not consistent in providing the right documentation when it came to land ownership or for compensation, which meant that it left us in a gray area where sometimes you were in fact dealing with the rightful landowner who simply did not have the right paperwork to prove it, but there were of course also people who were exploiting that situation, knowing that they could claim that it was their land even when it wasn't. Add to that having camp management committees of the Rohingya population in the camps who had a high level of power and were at times using this to extort humanitarian agencies, banding together with local landowners to completely exploit this gray area and ensure that, that humanitarian organizations were going to be paying bribes. And then we looked at what could we possibly be doing about this. One of the things that came up was asking the government for a clarification of the official boundaries of the camps. Now, on the one hand, this would have been positive if we had a government issued statement saying the boundaries lie exactly here. Within these boundaries, humanitarian services will be free, and anything outside of that is not part of the camp, and then it is free game and is the same as any other land in the country. That would have been positive, but at the same time, as these camps had expanded and grown due to population growth over the last couple of years, many of the Rohingya had started using land that was kind of in this gray area where it was unclear as to whether it was part of the camp or not for agricultural purposes. And because we were not allowed to stimulate a lot of livelihoods in the camps through humanitarian activities, we also did not want to have a situation where the government clarified the borders, and then this meant that land was being taken away from people who were relying on that for income generating purposes and to complement their food distributions. And so at the time we chose to leave that in that gray area and simply tackle it on a one-to-one basis. And so then I'll come shortly to the steps that we took, but when it says what can we do, these are the things that we were trying to focus on. As mentioned by Kirsty, camp management is uniquely placed in its ability to engage with the community and have direct contact with them and be kind of the bridge between the population that we are working with and the other humanitarian service providers. We also work very strongly to bring together the NGOs, because as you can imagine, if there's one NGO who says, sure, I will pay you 1,000 USD to build a health clinic here, that kind of crumbles when then all the other NGOs try to push back against that, because it's very easy for people to say, well, this organization did it, why won't you? So trying to bring people together on the same page so that we would all stand firm in what were our principles and what we would or would not pay for. Then doing things simply like clarifying the process, trying to figure out which government department was or was not going to issue documentation or was going to issue compensation, and then agreeing on pathways that we could all jointly use to raise these issues up so that we were all approaching it in the same manner, taking away some of the gray areas in those processes that could potentially be exploited. Dahlia, could you go to the next slide? So as Catherine was mentioning with the example in Somalia, a lot of what we do is focused on tracking. So a very basic thing that we did was create this incredibly ugly, and I'm very sorry for your eyes, Excel spreadsheet. which was then shared with all implementing partners in the Sittwe and the Paktau camps in Rakhine. And this was used to simply track issues that were coming up with regards to HLP. I don't know if you can see it, but like it'll say things like the landowner from this village wants compensation for this. And because that, he is threatening to block activities. The landowner is blocking the construction of latrines, for example. And this was merely a starting point so that we could see how many actors were facing the same issues and what they were doing about them. Because prior to that, everything was being tackled on a one-to-one basis. So the wash partner couldn't put in latrines. They would go directly to this government department or negotiate with the landowner and try to resolve it. But the government did not have a clear picture from the humanitarian side on like how many issues we were facing, what types of issues we were facing, and how widespread the issue was. So we simply started by plotting this all together and being able to track which issues were coming up. And then from that, we went into the next slide. Dahlia, if you could click through. Dahlia, could you click through to the next slide that has the flowchart on it?
Yes. Oh, hang on, sorry. It's paused for some reason. Oh, let me try. Oh, it was going so well. Hang on.
Well, otherwise I can briefly explain while you're looking.
Yeah, yes, please do, because I'm just trying to work out why it's not.
Sure, no worries. So from this, we were not only able to track the types of issues that people were facing, but also able to track the different pathways that they were using to advocate for change. And then we tried to streamline those because we figured if there's one clear process, then at every step where it gets stuck, we can say, all right, we agreed that this would be the next step following on from there. And it also made it, yes, this one please. So as you can tell, this is not very high tech or anything. It is just a very basic overview of this is what we agree with all service providers in this area. So you bump into an issue, put it in the tracking sheet. Then the service provider has the responsibility to discuss this with the camp management committees and inform the camp management agency of that camp. And then from there on, going further and further up the different responsibilities. So noting that the camp management agency is then responsible for raising it to the township administrator and the camp focal point and requesting a meeting with the general administration department, et cetera, so that we would know at every step, what is the next possible thing that we can do. Now, bearing all of this in mind, I'm not going to tell you that this was a perfect solution and that everything was highly successful, because it wasn't. But at least it was a means of trying to get everybody on the same page. And it also meant that we had a lot more credibility when discussing with OCHA, for example, or with the resident coordinator's office, in saying that this isn't just one individual problem that this one actor has faced. No, across the board, this is what we're seeing. What we request from the government is a clear set of guidelines on which documentation is required, who owns which land, and how they're issuing compensation, and also clear focal points on who deals with what, ensuring that it's not always just one service provider who's speaking directly to a landowner, but that there's going to be presence of the township administrator, for example, so that we could agree on that. So this was our example of how we had a reactive response to HLP issues coming up in camps, specifically with regards to humanitarian space. Dahlia, if you could click the next one. Okay, so then going from, yeah, you can click them all through and they'll just pop up. So going from a reactive response, we also had to look at how we could be proactive and prevent these issues from arising. So the camps that I just mentioned were in central Rakhine. And as you may know, in northern Rakhine, a population of over 800,000 Rohingya fled across the border into Bangladesh. Now, as soon as this started happening from August 25th of 2017 onwards, the government of Myanmar was very clear on the fact that they were expecting people to return, provided they had the right paperwork, which is a different story, and that the government was actively setting up camps in northern Rakhine that would not be permanent camps, but would be sort of transit sites in which people would be processed and then be allowed to return to their lands. Knowing this, the humanitarian community in central Rakhine felt that there was a need to start thinking about how we would respond to that. Within NRC, we did not want to be placed in a situation where camps would be established in northern Rakhine and we would be requested either by UNHCR or by the government to manage them and end up in the exact same situation that we had in the central Rakhine camps, where borders were unclear, HLP issues were rampant, and we were dealing with them on like an ad hoc basis. And so I'll get to the example of how we dealt with that shortly, but this is just a little bit of context as to why we felt we needed to put HLP front and center, with the possibility of camps being placed on land that had been taken away from the population or where compensation had not been issued. So a lot of this was about understanding the land and people's relationship to it. In situations where there isn't necessarily a structure of, or a system of providing proper documentation, it also comes down to that level of community engagement again, understanding how people in one community understand who is the landowner. If that's communal ownership that goes by family lines, or if that's by tribal or ethnic lines, and how then you are able to prove it is that you should bring 2 witnesses who can say that it's yours, etc. Understanding that so that we weren't purely relying on government systems saying that if you have this piece of paper, it's yours, yes or no. Because when land has been confiscated and that paper isn't there, there are other ways of understanding how the population relates to it. And so just jumping to the last point there, what we tried to do was get a better understanding of the land simply by talking to people and doing things like focus group discussions, looking at the legal framework in Myanmar, and then setting up either, well, red lines, we like to call them, but sometimes just red flags, of ensuring that we would not be complicit in land grabbing and camps being placed on land that had been illegally confiscated from a population. And I'll get back to an Iraq example shortly, but Dahlia, if you could just click through to the next one. So here, please don't feel like you have to read all of the bullet points on this slide, but what we did as NRC was we drafted a document which was red lines for engagement in camp management and engagement in service provision in camps in Northern Rakhine. We established this quite early on in the hopes that then we would be able to monitor what was taking place in Northern Rakhine and make an informed decision about whether we were complicit in some of the crimes being committed, or whether we could safely engage in these camps based off of humanitarian imperative and provide services to the population there. So as you can see, this is the section in which we largely focused on HLP, such as NRC will not engage in camp management of camps placed on land illegally confiscated from the population. Or taken away by the government, or placed on fertile agricultural land, which would risk food insecurity, bearing all of this in mind. And so we saw this as a very positive step because we were also able to engage with other NGOs in Northern and Central Rakhine and say that this is how we're approaching it. We're happy to share with you our red lines so that we can agree on a way forward, and that we are, again, coming back to speaking with one communal voice, not divided when suddenly we are pushed to respond. Because different NGOs will always take different responses and in many cases interpret humanitarian imperative differently. And so we wanted to ensure that at least we had something to be looking at and something to be reading from. Now again, not going to say that was perfect, because here the issue that we dealt with was how are we going to monitor that? And how are we going to ensure that these red lines were not being crossed? And so I guess luckily or unluckily, that situation was not yet faced, as populations have not started returning from from Bangladesh actively into Myanmar. But this is something that we would like to work on in future for other responses, taking a framework such as this and taking these red lines and making that a little bit more concrete so that you can say, okay, we will monitor the response for 3 to 6 months. And we will require that this and this paperwork is provided by the government, that these assurances are given, and then adjust the red lines accordingly. So that's how we dealt with that in Myanmar. And one small other thing to mention, perhaps with regards to Iraq, and I noticed there are a couple of Iraq colleagues who have joined the call, so perhaps they will also have some insight into that, is that we also have a lot of populations who are heading back into areas of return. We have people living in formal sites. We have people living in formal camps where forced evictions are taking place. And so we've tried to ensure, oh, sorry, someone's microphone is very loud. What we try to ensure is that in all assessments that take place, we emphasize HLP from the start. So if we're looking at an urban displacement out of camps response in areas of return, that the initial assessment and all of the surveys that take place also immediately ask questions about whether people are able to return to their property, whether they have received compensation or not. And a lot there, again, hinges on the camp management relationship with the population through community engagement, and as Kirsty was mentioning, referrals. So for NRC, we've tried to work on strengthening the relationship internally between our CAP management department and our ICLA teams, our information counseling and legal assistance, so that we are able to refer immediately, and we are also able to keep a track through community discussions of whether compensation is being provided, how the process is being interpreted, and which stumbling blocks populations are facing, so that we can refer those directly to our ICLA team and they can take it on from a legal perspective. And I think that is pretty much everything from my side, if I'm not mistaken.
Thanks, yes, that was very, very comprehensive, very good. I hope everybody saw the PowerPoints there as you were going through them. I thought I might start off by asking all three of you a question, because it's come up in each of your presentations. About the role of the community. So the response activity to try to support people from being evicted, from being exploited in terms of, you know, being by landowners and landlords, and affected by some of these housing issues that have come up in the course of camp settings. So I just wanted to ask each of you, from the experiences you've had, what could be more the role of the community? How could we bring out the role more of the community? And when I'm saying community, I think I mean both the community of landowners and landlords and maybe even authorities, so more the host community, and the communities of displaced people who are living in these camp settings. What can we do more, or what in your experience has worked to really ensure that communities are involved in part of these processes, so that it can really build into more of the preventative response? So maybe I'll go first, ask what I can see. Yasmin, you've popped up on the screen. So maybe I could go to you first just to see some of your reflections on that, and then I'll ask Catherine and Kirsty as well.
Sure, not sure how I popped up on the screen, but so I think that's a really good point. And I think on the one side, that's about harnessing the existing expertise in both camp management and in HLP or ICLA teams when it comes to community dispute resolution. Because I think that a lot of tools have already been established there, but we haven't necessarily brought those together. So there's, for example, if we're looking at areas of return, where potentially a property has been taken away from people during the displacement or during the conflict, that the camp management approach is very frequently establishing neighborhood committees and establishing focal points and having them map out the issues their community is facing and then trying to link those to service providers. But we're not necessarily always equipped with the tools to facilitate discussions, especially in the absence of systems and structure when it comes to documentation. We're not necessarily always equipped to facilitate those discussions between the host community and between the returning population, or in some cases the displaced population. And I think that's definitely a space in which a joint response between HLP and camp management would allow us to look at the skills that already exist there and take it as a joint response, rather than this very disconnected, frequently siloed response in which the community tells us these are issues and then we refer it to HLP and expect them to deal with it, as Catherine was saying in Somalia. So I think that that's definitely a starting point. And I think that the other is when we're looking at areas that have been destroyed. Oops, sorry, someone's microphone is.
Huh?
Sorry, could you mute your microphone?
Mama?
Right. Sorry, when we're looking at areas that have been destroyed during conflict and populations are returning, a conversation, for example, that we've been having with the Global Shelter Cluster and the Urban Settlements Working Group is how we can have more community involvement in urban planning and in site planning and reconstruction. And I think a lot of that then will also come back to like an understanding of ownership within the community. And so I think these are like the linkages that we have to be building on right now.
Thanks, Yasmin. Yeah, that's good reflections, because I think it's coming up, yeah, more and more, that while the responses are being provided and the support by the humanitarian community, there's a lot that can be done by the people themselves. And I guess we're all trying to support people coping and with the situations they're in as well. Just before I go to ask Catherine to reflect on that question as well, I think there is a way of, if anybody wants to, or I hope you do, raise a point, add a comment, or if you have a question for any of the panelists, there is a way of raising your hand to let me know that. So if you do that, then I will know who wants to speak, and we can do it in an organised way, I hope. So let's try that way. So if you want to ask a question or make a comment, there's a way you can contact me by raising or sending a message through the chat function on Zoom. So I'll ask Catherine to maybe reflect as well from her experiences in Somalia in relation to the issue of bringing the aspects of the community together and what our role could be as humanitarians in that.
Sure, thanks. So one of the important things for Somalia to note is that it is mostly remote management. And so the communities are involved, I think a lot more possibly than in other contexts, because we're not on the ground. So our staff are on the ground working with the camp committees, but the camp committees are usually the ones doing most of the action. So we do mobile camp management, so they are visited by CCCM staff, but the camp committees are the driving force in most things. So two of the things I think that we could continue to improve in is, one of the biggest issues that we face is that people don't know enough about land tenure or see the importance. And so most agreements that we're seeing for IDP sites are oral, and they're oral and not like correct at all. And so we've been working on, in all of our camp committee trainings, on having a section on HLP, so that we can, you know, suggest that people get written agreements at camp level, and they can be community level agreements. So it doesn't have to be individual. It's usually not an individual agreement. It should be like negotiated by the group for the entire site. And so we're like pushing them to get them written down and to involve the government in this, so that there's a bit more accountability rather than just 500 people who are at the mercy of a gatekeeper. And then the second thing that we've seen has successfully worked in the last few years is for more protracted IDPs that have been living in these areas for a long time. They've come together at like site level rather than individually and purchase land. And so people who've been living in IDP sites for 5-10 years, you know, if it's like 500 households, they'll pool their money and buy space where they can all live together, where it wouldn't be possible for an individual to have purchased a plot. And so everyone comes together, and usually people settle with their clan. And so when you have 300 IDP sites and you arrive into a town, there's usually people kind of working at the entry points of the road to tell you what your options are and where to go and where your clan is. And so it's a bit easier because people are settling in with their regular community and they might know them already. And then they're able to negotiate on behalf of, you know, negotiate together to have more of a permanent place to live. And so these are the two things that we're pushing on, is better understanding of the importance of land tenure, so that we just show up and then pay rent and have no ability to negotiate with the landowner, and then to have more durable solutions through provision of land and buying the land.
Thanks, that's really interesting actually in that context, and I'm seeing that in a lot of other countries as well, where camps or informal settlements become sort of longer term solutions, and then what is the role in terms of the humanitarian and even other development actors as well in terms of supporting communities. And I think that really connects that point that housing and land issues are so relevant. Whatever we do in terms of response at the start of a response has relevance throughout, and also when looking at longer term solutions, which is why it's so important to understand what people's relationship is to the land. Yeah, passing over to you, because you've got the sort of global overview as well from your experiences. How is it, if you reflect as well on the point about communities?
Sure. In addition to what Catherine and Yasmin have said, I think If we get back to basics as well in some of the contexts that we work, one of the things that's coming up a lot in our evaluations, for example, is the need for very basic two-way communication. So when we're doing a lot of work on behalf of communities that are in informal settlements or camps, how are we providing information about what is happening, what the different ministries are saying around their land, who, you know, the discussions, so providing information back to them as to what is going on and you know, who is owning the land. A lot of the time people just don't understand or don't know because they haven't ever had the chance to ask some of the questions, or they're not aware that they're even able to do that. So I think that way of communication, but what also camp management is really good at is obviously then the two-way communication in terms of understanding what the problems and the solutions are from community perspective. And I mentioned that at the beginning, but I do think camp management's emphasis on communication on behalf of all of the programs as well in an operation is really important. What are the different sectors doing, and how can we provide them with information to make their decisions so that they're at the center of it? So that is one of the first ones. And then the second one, I think, is in terms of community participation and engagement. This is something that we're working on, obviously, with Giovanna at the lead in NRC, is not just dealing with the usual actors in a community. So, for example, we all know as humanitarians, we are not really looking into inter-household. We do household level studies, and we know from our work that women are within households, or women's headed households, are experiencing a lot more HLP security of tenure barriers, and they have different challenges, and we don't necessarily engage them or engage other potentially marginalized groups within a community. So the role of the community then and camp management can be to really engage with a full spectrum of people through a proper participatory methodology to understand what the vulnerabilities are, and how we can support those who are perhaps faring the worst or most at risk of eviction, or will be at most at risk if they are evicted, and really taking into account the intra-household within households, the dynamics that really can make sure that can ensure that people are really taken into consideration when we're looking at a proper response to eviction. So the two things are, one is two-way communication, providing communities with an understanding of what we're doing on their behalf and being informed in our response by that, and understanding much better the full range of demographics of people that we're working for, in being able to understand and prioritize those who are most at risk. Thanks.
Thank you. And I know Walid has something to bring in here on the community engagement point. So over to you, Walid. And if you just introduce yourself before you bring up your question or make your point, that would be really helpful. Over to you.
Thank you. This is Walid Hail, Yemen Red Crescent Society. First of all, I appreciated the initiatives for conducting this meeting. Actually, it's useful, and we learn a lot from the other partners, and partners' experience in camp management. I'd like to share some comments regarding the community engagement in the planning of camp management. Based on our experience in Red Crescent, it's very important to engage the community, starting from the first assessment and the land ownership. Also to engage the government and all the authorities in coordination, which is very important for protecting the affected persons and vulnerable people. Especially sometimes the effect to the camp or to the land, which is not honored for the government, or not related. Not owned by the government. It's a private, land, and it's owned by the community themselves. So first of all, we have to, to engage the community authorities, local leaders, in coordination and assessment and selection of the best location for a camp. Also, we have to
Walid, we lost you. I don't know if that was your microphone or the internet. We can't hear you anymore.
In our plan.
Okay, yes,
Involved,
that's better. We can hear you again now.
That's all from my side. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Well, Waleed, sorry, the last point I did not hear after you were saying about engaging communities and the local authorities and community leaders, because your internet I couldn't hear what you said. So if you could just repeat the last point, that would be great.
It's very important to engage. The local community and authorities too, because and our short on our or private people, so their engagement in dissemination, their engagement in coordination, they have to be the owner of this project. This is the real success. The community themselves, they have to know or to feel they are a part of, and the leaders of this camp. So this is the success. If we don't do that, actually we will face a lot of problems with the community, especially, for example, in Yemen, we are in civil war since more than 4 years, and some of the landowner, if they are not engaged, they will feel this is something is not acceptable and respected by the community themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Waleed. Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, we've seen that as the HLP, the global AoR, for a number of countries where land has been provided ostensibly by local or national authorities for setting up camps, and later claims have arisen from private rights holders, whether they own the land or have other rights in land, have come up at a later stage, which then has put people living on the land in the camp at risk. So again, going back to that point, as well as the community engagement of including that as part of the due diligence, we really know what all the rights are in the land before going ahead with the intervention, and then monitoring the situation, because some of the things or assurances that we might be given initially may turn out not to be the full picture. So really trying to understand that, and probably by engaging the communities, those issues would come up a lot earlier. And I think, as Waleed really pointed out there, make sure that people are part of the process, seen as being a bit more transparent and feeding the accountability obligations that we have and strive to achieve. Just to let you all know, I think many of you do, but the HLP area of responsibility at global level really works to support HLP coordination and responses at country level, and that's its main purpose. There are areas of responsibility or subclusters, technical working groups, they've got many different names at country level, dealing with housing, land and property issues. Usually they're sitting under the global protection cluster, but sometimes they may be under the shelter cluster or jointly. All that to say that there is HLP area groups focusing on these issues. So some of the context that today from some of the presentations that working, the CCCM colleagues working with the HLP subcluster has been useful to look at these points together, because when it comes to due diligence, it's relevant for so many of the interventions that we do as part of the humanitarian response. So I just wanted to let you know, in the different contexts that you're all in, if there is a subcluster or area of responsibility at country level, I hope you feel able to engage with them. And that's useful for your work. If there isn't one and you are wondering how to get that overview of housing, land, property issues, we, the global AoR, set up to support country responses, even if there is not an area of responsibility in country. So please also feel free to contact us. And we can work on these issues together, really also building on and taking experiences from other countries, because we're really seeing that there's so much work being done by CCCM actors everywhere. And now it's just thinking about how to learn from those experiences and benefit from them in a variety of contexts. So that's my small advert for the HLP coordination mechanisms. But I want to see if anybody else has questions or comments that they would like to share or raise at this chance, at this opportunity, at this moment, or if you have any questions for any of the panelists. I don't see any hands up at the moment. Hi, is that Mahmoud?
Excuse me.
Yes, your internet. But
This is Mahmoud Mohammed from.
yes, go ahead.
Excuse me, but the net connection is right here. Sorry, this is Mahmoud Mohammed, one of the partners in Yemeni Women organization. I just want to ask about something that is, hovering in my mind regarding the attempts and regarding to the camp management. That since such a civil war 4 years ago, maybe, and a lot of IDPs has displaced from one place to another, and a lot of use IDPs. So, for example, here in we do have a lot of IDPs that are coming from so many different governorates and have no place to settle in. But
Oh, sorry, Mahmoud, I can't hear you. I just heard the first part about having the many displaced people. Maybe if you want, you can write your question and I can share it. If you write it in the chat function, then that could be something, then I could share it with the panelists or raise it, because I'm not hearing you. You're cutting out. Sorry, Mahmoud. Please do write. If you write it in the chat, then I can read it out as well.
Cam,
everybody.
do you hear me? Excuse me,
yes.
Do you hear me?
Yeah, that's better. Yes. Oh no, it went again. I think we're going to have to. Please, Mahmoud, can you just write your question or comment in the chat function, and I can read it out. I think that's the best thing because the connection's not great at that. Does anyone else have any, be great to hear from any of the other countries online, or any questions or any sharing any of the experiences that you in terms of housing, land, property issues coming up in the course of camp management or coordination work. Okay, I don't think I'm waiting to see what Mahmoud, question is. Okay, I got the, okay, Giovanna, you have a question, please, while we're waiting for Mahmoud to write out his comment, please.
Yeah, I have just general questions, then maybe we can go back to the one of Mahmoud. But I wanted to ask you, to the presenters, so what would be the suggestion in terms of way forward? So what, I mean, something already came out from the presentation, but what would be the recommendation for the CCM cluster, for the sectors? What we need to do more in terms of capacity building or understanding of case study or best practice, if they can give us one or two recommendations to bring forward this work, what would be their priority?
Thanks, Giovanna. Okay, I'll hand it over. Why don't we start with Catherine first of all? It'd be great to hear what do you may have many recommendations, but what are the main things you think we could do to take this work forward, which I think we're all very keen on doing.
Well, I don't want to get too technical. I also attended the HLP session when we had the global workshop for CCCM in Geneva, and it was good to just start talking about it. I would say, in my last two positions until Somalia, I worked in a more traditional camp management setting where we had land from the government for a camp. And so I never thought of HLP. And so when I got to Somalia, this was not on my radar at all. And after the global cluster workshop, I saw we only deal in evictions mostly and lack of tenure, but there's HLP issues across the world that different CCCM actors are facing. So I think just raising the profile of the fact that this is something that CCCM can engage in and should engage in, and making sure that CCCM practitioners understand the importance of HLP and what it is. So just basic, raising the profile to all of us that this is something that you're going to face, this is what it is, and this is how you can engage in it. So it doesn't have to be really technical in terms of tools, because every country is different. but just like a general, like putting on the, like on the map that CCCM and HLP should work together, and that this is like a new direction we're going into, especially with the out of camp stuff, especially with the mobile teams. And just so that when you are faced with it as a camp manager, etc., you know that this is something that you can support and who to go to, essentially.
Thanks, that's a great recommendation. I've written, I think it really came out of the, yeah, that was a really useful session at the Global CCCM Costa retreat, actually. Just bringing out, I think for me, what came out was that there are lots of there's lots of work being done by CCCM actors. I think Kirsty, I think you all referred to that in your presentations. It's just capturing it more and building, because a lot's already being taken forward. If I can pass over to Yasmin for your top recommendations for ways that we can follow up back.
Yeah, I think I'd like to tack on to what Catherine was saying, and it's kind of, I would say, demystifying HLP. Because as I think we've seen in multiple responses for CCCM actors, it's so easy to just say, oh, it's an HLP problem and pass it on to a legal actor because we don't understand what it is properly. And I think in addition to that, it would be really helpful to start compiling kind of lessons learned and tools that are already being used in different countries, so those can be used as reference materials for field practitioners. And that I think will help a lot with breaking down into the basics what HLP issues are for CCCM actors and how we can engage with them. So if that's just like, sharing around this red lines document so that people can see, oh, perhaps these are things to think about when looking at due diligence before engaging in a camp. Or if that's the different metrics that were used in Somalia to look at like the eviction risk mapping, simply having those available in a centralized place, I think would be incredibly helpful for actors in the field, so that it's, I would say, less of a confusing concept, and makes it easier as well for CCCM actors to reach out to the HLP subcluster where present, because they know what they can expect from them and how we can support each other.
Thanks, Yasmin, that's great. Kirsty.
Hi, yes, well, building on what the others have said, I think within NRC, it's true that we need to have much more conversations around the role of camp management in HLP and how we are, I mentioned this in the presentation, how we are integrating that across our programs. So I think the thing that we would like to do is really promote the camp management's role with our legal assistants and our shelter teams, and support country offices to work across that, recognizing camp management's role in that. And also from a soft skills development perspective, Giovanna and I have, this is something Giovanna's leading on, is supporting colleagues in the work that they already do every day, and that is negotiation, the preventing disputes, the work that would help them to even better solve some of the issues, work with communities. So from that perspective, we would look at soft skills training for colleagues on mediation, negotiation. So that's a priority for us within NRC over the next couple of years in terms of support, and hopefully that will builds on the work that, like you're saying, everybody is already doing, and helps to improve that, as well as actually, of course, to keep having these conversations. Thanks, Dalia, for arranging that and sharing experience and practice within the sector. And it's not just always about the documents, it's talking through the tools and the experiences, like, for example, that Catherine and Yasmin have done. I think we need to have more of these kind of discussions that are, hopefully people can feel comfortable to raise some of the issues that they are facing, and to talk them through with other practitioners. So this is super useful, I think. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to ask if you have any suggestions or recommendations for ways that we can take this work forward. If I'm allowed to ask, if you, oh, maybe, Giovanna, did you hear me? No, maybe not. But what I wanted to say is that from the HLP AoR perspective, we had a strategy last week going through the work plan for 2019, and it really came out, and I think a lot of that was based on being invited by the CCCM cluster, so thank you to participate and help facilitate the session on housing, land, property and camp settings during their retreat in October. So we've definitely included that firmly in our work plan follow-up for next, in terms of this type of awareness raising, but I think it's as you've all said, it's more sharing of experiences and talking through them, because we realize that there are actually there's so many similarities, although yes, it's very context specific often in terms of the actual laws and ways that things are dealt with in each area. In terms of how we approach them, there are a lot of similarities, and I think just that interaction and what we've started because of that invite by the CCCM cluster has really opened that up. So we've firmly included that in the work plan for next year. I see that we have another question from Alois about during conflict there are spontaneous camp settings which occupy private lands. What can we do, especially when the conflict is taking a long time? So having leading to prolonged displacement, I guess. Well, I think, Catherine, you talked a little bit about that, and also Yasmin in the Myanmar context. So I don't know, Catherine, if you might just say a few words on how you had a bit of it, but how you're dealing with private land, because most of the land that the camps and the spontaneous camp settings are on are owned privately. So just to maybe remind us or a few other things that you're doing in terms of working with communities living on those lands.
I mean, I don't think I have any good examples. Somalia is very difficult for this reason, because the most displacement is quite protracted. Then we had a big displacement last year of an additional 1.6 million that are new, but through like different things we've done, it says like 90% of them want to stay where they are. And so we're going into like a big new programming area within the next few years on what to do with all of these protractedly displaced people. I don't really have great, I don't have great examples. Two things that I could mention were in one district called Dolo, they're one of the only public camps that exists is there. There's about 60,000 people displaced. They've been there since 2010. There's been a population that's continued to grow. It's a lot easier to do humanitarian services there and development services because it's public space. And so we can invest in infrastructure and we can improve the living conditions in these sites. And these sites are within the town. So they don't look like a camp, it looks like a neighborhood where it just kind of continues to grow, and you can do pretty good urban planning. It's not a very urban area, but you can do city planning there and everything because the government has accepted the fact that these people are coming, that they're gonna stay there. And so we might as well do it in the proper way. In other areas where it is it's all spontaneous settlements that are self-settled on private land. The living conditions are much worse. We can't do much infrastructural investment because of evictions. There'll be mass evictions where all this, 10 schools, all the water points, everything will be destroyed or like raised by heavy machinery. And so people are very hesitant to invest in these areas, and then the living conditions are very poor. So the Dolo example of the public space is good. And then in Baidoa, I mentioned that the government has just decided to give public space. So humanitarians are able to invest more in infrastructure in those areas. But it's been a huge challenge in Somalia. And we haven't come to any way forward on that yet, especially because in areas like Mogadishu, where there's so many people, the government says there's no public land. So in the past 5 years, there's been different schemes where they say, okay, we'll give space for IDPs, but there's 500,000 people and they want to give a small space and create a mega camp, which is not what people also want to do. So we're not supportive of, just putting all displaced people into one chunk of space outside of town because it's the only public space. So it's a very big issue in Somalia that we have no great ideas on how to solve yet.
Thanks. I appreciate it's a very difficult situation, but good to be thinking about it because it's going to keep coming up as well in other places. Yasmin, did you have anything to add to that?
I don't have a lot to add to that, just that, I mean, it's a challenge that we've faced in so many different places. And that a lot of it, as Catherine was mentioning, comes down to negotiations and advocacy with the government. At times, it's going to be incredibly difficult to persuade a government to allocate something as public land and leave it for humanitarian space and humanitarian services. So then it comes down to a negotiation and I think an explanation to government of how it's also beneficial to them if they allow this space to be used by the displaced population, sometimes avoiding tensions with host communities, avoiding further conflict, and kind of trying to explain why it would be beneficial and then striking potentially just a bargain that is for a short period of time while you look for more durable solutions for the displaced population. So it's not a clear-cut answer on how we can tackle this, but I think it is a lot about that, about finding ways to explain why this works for government and not just perpetuating the narrative as, all these humanitarians are taking this land to serve just this displaced population. So pitching it that way.
Thank you. Kirsty, I see you've sent something to us as well.
Yeah, I just posted in the chat the link to the Syria colleagues' guidance on HLP issues in informal camps and settlements in North Syria. So I think there is supposed to be a guidance. It talks through the steps and the reflections and the lessons learned from exactly this issue that they've been dealing with, and including negotiating with landlords, the kinds of some lessons learned from the community there. So that might be helpful, even if it's not exactly the same context. I think it might be helpful in understanding how others have approached this. Thanks.
Thank you. I've got a couple of raised hands, so we'll just go to those. Sean, if you introduce yourself as well and make your point, over to you.
Hi. I have a quick question. First of all, my name's Sean. I'm based in Myanmar. I'm a former UNHCR staff member, and now I'm an independent consultant. I guess I only work on HLP issues, and I've been in Myanmar for the last 2 years, focusing on that. I have a question actually about Somalia, because I was there briefly in 2016, early 2017. I was just wondering if there's been any sort of improvement in the situation with evictions. They were rampant when I was there, and really the HLP subcluster and the HLP partners were kind of focused on really, I guess, responding and reporting. Just because of the complexity of the context, there wasn't a lot that could be done in terms of prevention. But I was just wondering, apart from the eviction risk mapping that one of the presenters was mentioning, if there's been any sort of improvements or any activities that take a more preventative approach since that time.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass that over to Catherine.
Sure, thanks. Okay, so I mentioned one of the tools that we do, which is in collaboration with HLP. So that's the CCCM and HLP collaboration. The HLP subcluster does tons of work around evictions all of the time. And so I just it's not the only thing we're doing is mapping the evictions. But I would say also the eviction, it hasn't gotten better. The situation is worse now. I think it's an all-time high of evictions. Like on a monthly basis, there's tens of thousands of people evicted. The partners are constantly working towards this. But I would say the thing that has improved now is that it's gotten everyone's attention. Maybe a year ago, evictions were happening every day and no one paid attention to them except for when there's a mass eviction in one of the areas of like 10 to 15,000 people. But one of the things that we've been trying to raise the profile on is that there's an eviction every day somewhere, or 10 evictions every day. And so in these smaller districts where there's lots of IDPs, there's 100 families evicted every single day. And so while the scale of eviction has increased and it's really bad, at least now everyone can collectively understand that it's a big issue, especially the government, and the government is finally working towards ways to respond to the evictions. Before, they kind of just pushed it at us, like, this is your problem, humanitarians, respond. But now in Mogadishu, in Baidoa, in Kismayo, and in other areas, that they're finally seeing that this is the role of the government and they have to do something about it because the IDPs aren't returning home. The landowners are still evicting people. Urbanization is going at a crazy pace. And so that it's the responsibility, they have to take this on themselves to kind of act to make things better. They're looking obviously at the humanitarian community and the development community for funding for this, but they have started to see that it's their issue to deal with and that they can't just kick people off land and then we give them a new plastic sheet or whatever.
Thank you. Oh, and that really shows that sort of awareness raising opens the space sometimes for us then to provide more of a response or to work with the authorities as well. Neil, you had a question. Hello. If you'd introduce yourself or a comment, please, and go ahead.
Yes, hello everybody. It's a comment. My name is Neil. I'm the Global Manager for Shelter and Settlements at NRC. I work with Giovanna, Kirsty, and Dalia. And I was just going to say the presentations were really, really great. And I thought a lot of the stuff that appeared in Yasmin and Catherine's presentation is reinforced and really captured in the new security of tenure standard in the Sphere handbook, which was launched last month. And so we hope that is a very empowering standard to facilitate a lot of these discussions being had in your country offices, especially explicitly around understanding the frameworks in the local context, in terms of response, monitoring, and advocacy. And in terms of the point that was made, sometimes it's better to do nothing from a do no harm perspective. And while that standard appears in the Shelter and Settlements chapter, we think a number of different sectors will find it relevant, and it would be sad if it was only seen as part of the shelter sector when really it's part of anything associated with shelter and settlements, housing and settlements. And I think going forward, it'll be interesting to get feedback from the different clusters on that standard and how it supports and reinforces their work. But of course, as Kirsty said as well, guidance isn't capacity necessarily. And so there's a lot of work happening in the HLP AoR globally to really raise awareness and build capacity around security of tenure across clusters. So I look forward to hearing feedback on that standard and how it's being interpreted in country over the coming months and years. And just also, I mean, it's come up a number of times, the importance of working together. I mean, definitely with the camp management cluster and the shelter cluster, in many countries they're merged. They are one in the same cluster. And I think it's neat to see, like, there's been lots of great initiatives and discussions for group populations, but when we come to maybe more dispersed populations, and camp management have their methodologies, but also the interlinkages with the shelter, ICLA, and others is super interesting. And also on the tools, in terms of where people can get additional information for, I don't know if it's best practice, but just practice in general. I mean, Kirsty shared that one from the Syria team, but also NRC will be publishing this month, available next year, our Securing Tenure and Shelter Operations. And don't be off put by the title. I think it applies equally to the camp management cluster as well, because in that we have basically case studies for all 25 of our country programs in terms of, okay, how did shelter and ICLA and camp management for that matter work together in terms of addressing what is secure enough for this particular context? If we're supporting people in this informal settlement, what are the permissions we need to have in place and the tenure instruments in order to make sure that we are secure enough, whether it's reconstruction or first line response or protracted displacement. And so I hope that'll make for interesting Christmas reading for a number of people on the call. And we look forward to hearing feedback on that after you've reviewed it. But that's it. But thanks a lot. This has been it's been excellent to be part of the call. Thanks, Dalia.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, definitely highlighting that we're big fans of the new Sphere standard on security of tenure. The big focus for the AoR next year, because it's relevant, really just anything to do with any interventions to do with land or housing. It's the things that we need to think about as part of that, and it sets it out in a really easy to use, well, easy to understand, I hope, and then the using part is what we're going to be working on next year, really trying to facilitate how to put these ideas and key actions into practice. Now I see Giovanna's on the line again, so I'm not going to let her get away. I just wanted to ask her if she had any suggestions in terms of recommendation for taking this work forward, as that was her the panelists all gave their recommendations. So Giovanna, if you have anything you wanted to add.
No, I mean, I don't have much to add from you know, what the ladies already said. Yeah, I wish that more and more the CCM cluster would, you know, look at the you know, yes, HLP and the security of tenure, not only, I mean, not with let's say fear or like, okay, it's somebody else's business. but more engaging in discussion and maybe understanding, I mean, having more awareness about the, the tools, the standards, the training, the capacity building existing, but then also, and then maybe trying to, to identify if there are specific contribution that the CCM activities could bring to this discussion. So Kirsty was mentioning about, some work we're doing internally with NRC, and maybe things that are already existing, but just we need to articulate a bit better, and demonstrate a bit better. But I think, being open and engaged in discussion, this would be my main recommendation.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good note to end on. Thanks all for your participation. It's been great to have such a range of people taking part. I want to really thank the three panelists as well for their insight and sharing those with us. So thanks to Catherine, to Yasmin, to Kirsty. I really think it's been said a few times, but this is just another step along the way for us to all work together. It's really come out in the work that the AoR has done with CCCM colleagues this year, that CCCM has such a core role for a lot of this work, especially those skills related to community engagement and supporting people to support themselves. So I look forward to our work together. If anybody has any questions or would like any support in the countries they're working, please do get in contact with me as the HLP AoR coordinator. We did record this session, so I will also be able to send it out. If you have any other questions, please also contact me, and I've made a note of the recommendations, so I'll also send those out and make sure that they're firmly things that we follow up with our CCCM colleagues and within the cluster, with the other clusters as relevant as well. So thank you very much. It's been really enjoyable, and I think Zoom has held up well. So thank you, and look forward to the next session. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you to you.
Thank you, Dalia. Thank you very much.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you for everybody.
Dalia, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi. Yeah, just before I take off, I was just going to say, I'm not sure if the other colleagues are interested, but the last couple of years I've been collecting, do a lot of research on HLP staff, and I've got a pretty large collection of academic material on HLP.
Okay.
I'm not sure if anyone's interested in it, or if anyone, if the AoR has anything like a database of academic stuff, or whether that's even useful. I don't know. But I just finished my degree, but I'll have access for another, I think, 6 months. I don't know 100% on that, but so yeah, if any of the colleagues get in touch and they're after academic staff, they can feel free to put them in touch with me or.
Okay. I tell you what, Sean, on behalf of the AoR, I mean, I will follow up with you, and maybe we can find a way of sharing those materials, putting them on the website, or at least sharing the relevant links, because there is the global AoR website which we could use, and we're updating to make it a bit more user friendly. So do that, and then of course, if anyone else is wanting to follow up, they feel free to do that as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
Cool.
Thanks for raising
Thanks.
that. Thank you, Sean.
No
All
worries.
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.